Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of RE383, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. This particular story is called The Scary Sound, written by HFY. Only 17 out of the 550 dropships made it off the planet. 3 were leaking so badly that half the evacuated soldiers died before they made it back to their motherships, and 2 lost power altogether, tumbling back into the atmosphere as their comrades watched, helpless. As the 15 surviving ships, horrifically damaged, docked with their respective vessels, Vice Admiral in charge of the fleet was already giving orders to withdraw from the system. The screams of horror and the begging for any kind of reinforcements had shaken him more than he wished to admit. It was clear that the natives of this planet called Terra were well acquainted with war, to the point that his hardened troops had never stood a chance. "Have the surviving officers attend my ready room as soon as they are able," he ordered, then withdrew to begin writing up his own report. This mission to harvest bioorganic matter had been badly conceived from the start. He had virtually no input in the planning stage, though in all fairness, he wasn't sure how this input would have changed matters. A little time later, 28 officers, commanders, and seconds in command filed into Vice Admiral Parash's ready room. He waited until they had gotten themselves settled, and then inflated his primary lung. "We have lost over 10,000 soldiers, as well as 1,000 trained pilots and over 500 dropships. Do we know that all of the dropships were destroyed, and all personnel killed?" There was a nervous silence, as all the officers breathed only via their secondary lung, keeping the primary inflated in case they were called upon to speak. After it had dragged on for altogether too long, he pointed towards the senior officer of the drop corps. "Major Kalarak, I know you don't know, but give me your best guess." Kalarak, clearly uneasy to be singled out like that, shifted, as though to hide behind his fellow officers, but eventually stood firm.
"Sir, I would guess no."
Barash made a gesture of agreement. "That is also my guess, so unless they are entirely technically blind and deaf, they will be repairing what damage was done and interrogating our men, their prisoners, regarding their operation and maintenance." Kalalak second, a spindly fellow who looked as though he could be knocked over by a strong air current, raised his primary manipulator. Parash gestured to him. "Yes?" Sir, the maintenance manuals were stored on the dropships, so the techs would know where to find them." Within his mind, Parash likened the silence that bell once more to be akin to a deep and sucking swamp. It threatened to drag all of them down with them as they took in the implications. With the manuals, the Terrans had everything they needed to repair and fly the dropships. Wonderful. "I take it from your lack of argument that Terrans are technically adept." Parash tried for dark humor, missed altogether, and ended up rubbing his men's faces in their failure. "Yes and no, sir," that was Kalalak. "They don't have the gluon blaster or the neutrino rifle. Their weapons tech is solely chemical kinetic in nature." Parash barely restrained himself from shouting at the major. He breathed deeply, inflating and deflating his primary lung a couple times, until his reactions were under control. "How did they beat you, then?" His confusion was understandable. The society which had given rise to him had gone through stages of weapons development. But the one thing they hadn't managed to get right was the propulsion of kinetic projectiles via chemical means. It had eluded them for so long that all the major scientific institutions concluded that it was basically impossible. Once they had the pulse grav drive, it was easy to get into space, and energy weapons such as the gluon blaster and the neutrino rifle were extremely powerful for their size. "Their weapons were powerful for chemical propellants," Kalalak reported. "They had armored vehicles moving on linked treads with large kinetic weapons and tough. These could only withstand up to 10 gluon shots, but they could fire 3 or 4 shots while we were waiting for the gluon coils to re-energize for a single shot. They were knocking out our emplacements faster than we were putting them up." "That's bad, yes, but armored vehicles are always vulnerable to being swarmed," Parash said pointedly. "Why did you not do this?"
"Because they had infantry with smaller versions of this weapon." Kalalak made a gesture of despair. "Smaller than a neutrino rifle, but they fired much faster and had almost as much penetration. They made a noise like a ducka ducka ducka. And when their weapons ran dry of their ammunition, They crouched behind cover and put more in there, in less time than it takes to talk about it.
Parash didn't like the sound of this. Typically, it took the time to eat a good meal to recharge your neutrino rifle, but he still didn't have the full image. He also had armored fighting vehicles. They mount glue-on cannon. Could your infantry not support those?
Kalalak closed his ocular organs for a moment.
We tried, he whispered.
We really did try, sir, his second ventured. But there was the other thing.
The other thing?
Parash somehow knew he wasn't going to like this. It wasn't due to any kind of prescient ability, just superb pattern recognition.
Yes, Kalalak made a gesture of extreme unhappiness.
We were dug in pretty well, interlocking fields of fire, men swapping out, keeping them guessing. They couldn't advance on us, and we'd gotten lucky shot in on one of their armored monstrosities, so its kinetic cannon was out of action. And then we heard it.
Parash didn't want to ask the question.
Heard what?
The shrieking sound. Kalalak's voice was the one who had traveled through the most unpleasant locations in the galaxy and come out the other side. Alive, but forever changed by the experience. Parash decided that he probably fit the description. And then what? Parash knew the likes of Kalalak would not be cowed by mere noise. And then they came over the hill, flying low, actual aerodynes, not gravlifters, wide wings, 2 modules towards the tail that were making the noise. I think they were the propulsion, making a noise like a fur pet with its tail caught in the door, only magnified by 10,000. They weren't even doing the local speed of sound, but that low down, they looked like they were going fast. Parash had to agree. Flying subsonic was one thing, but piloting something without gravlifters so low that the terrain masked one's approach was quite another thing altogether. Still, there was something that was puzzling. So they were noisy. Where's the problem?
The problem was, that wasn't the noise that we should have been worried about, Kalalak.
Kalalak turned his opticals towards his fellow officers. They all made shaky gestures of assent.
What we heard then was brrrt.
He shuddered, as if called. Brrrt, echoed the other officers, all emulating the shudder. Parash could tell they had been fundamentally changed by the experience.
What do you mean, brrrt? Demanded Parash. What does that mean?
Kalalak inflated his primary lung.
It means, sir, that they had a weapon on that aircraft that fired dozens of times per second, putting holes larger than my fist in infantry and turning our armored fighting vehicles into leaking hulks full of gore. Where they didn't just explode inside, the noise it made was brrrt.
How? Demanded Parash.
How are they making chemical kinetic weapons that are so powerful and fast-firing?
Nobody knew the answer to that one. Neither had he expected them to.
Very well, he decided. Write your reports, I'll send them in with mine. Dismissed.
With luck, he'd get an answer back and permission to open diplomatic relations before the Terrans figured out how to fix the dropships they'd captured and came off planet looking for the perpetrators. One by one, the remainder of his officer corps filed out, and he went back to his writing station. The mission was an abject failure, and soon he'd be finding out whether Terrans were the forgiving type.
Brrrt, he whispered, feeling the shivers of almost supernatural fear that permeated the room earlier. He hadn't been there, and he was still scared of the sound. On such things, he mused, rested the fate of the galaxy. A single, simple sound. Brrrt. End of story.
I'd quickly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.